9 Times Death Missed Lincoln, Episode 2, The Man in the Bathroom. He didn't know it yet, but if he had taken 3 more steps, he would have walked straight into a man waiting with a knife, in the shadows of a Capitol toilet. Chapter 1: A Walk Not on the Schedule. It began with a delay, not a delay caused by weather, or war, or politics, just a delay, the kind of minor adjustment that happens dozens of times in any presidential schedule, so small, so routine, that no one pays it much attention. But this time, it mattered. Abraham Lincoln was scheduled to meet with a group of senators that afternoon in a private chamber on the east side of the Capitol. The discussion was to center around Reconstruction, a word that was, by early 1864, both hopeful and dangerous. The war still raged, but Union victories were beginning to mount. There was talk of an end, and with it, the impossible question: what happens next? At 1:45 p.m., his carriage was supposed to leave the White House. At 1:43, an aide knocked gently on the door of his study and told him that the Senate clerk had requested a minor change. The meeting would take place in a different room, closer to the rotunda. Apparently, the original room had plumbing issues. Something about leaking pipes. Lincoln raised an eyebrow, half amused. Leaking politics or leaking water? He quipped. The aide didn't laugh. Lincoln didn't expect him to. He stood, pulled on his coat, and reached for his hat. "Let's go make peace," he said softly. What no one knew then, what they could not have known, was that beneath the Capitol, a man was already in place. A man with knowledge of the building's service corridors, its maintenance systems, and most importantly, its blind spots. He had entered hours earlier, wearing the uniform of a janitor. He carried no gun, only a knife. He wasn't late, but Lincoln was. The carriage ride was uneventful. The weather was mild. There were no crowds. By this point in the war, Washington had grown used to the sight of Lincoln moving through the streets. His frame tall, his gait stiff but steady, his face drawn into a mask of exhaustion that never quite lifted. He carried the Union in his spine, and it was starting to curve. The Capitol loomed ahead, white stone and scaffolding, still unfinished, still imperfect, a symbol of a nation at war with itself. Lincoln stepped down, nodded at the guard stationed at the east entrance, and walked inside. There was no formal escort. He didn't want one. 2 senators were already waiting for him near the rotunda, exchanging quiet comments about border states and election fears. They didn't see the man watching them from across the hall. He stood still, pretending to polish a brass fixture, his eyes fixed on the far corridor, the one that led past the maintenance closet, then turned sharply toward the restroom near the original meeting room. That room, room 12, was now empty. The assassin didn't know. No one had told him the meeting had moved. He waited, in the shadows, in the bathroom. If Lincoln had walked his original route, if the plumbing hadn't acted up, or if the clerk hadn't knocked 2 minutes early, or if the messenger had taken a different staircase, he would have entered that hallway at precisely 2:03 p.m. The man with the knife was ready at 2:02. History held its breath, but Lincoln turned left instead of right. The conversation with the senators began. He sat down, unfolded a document from his coat pocket, and began to speak about the shape of peace, about rebuilding railroads, about welcoming back states that had seceded, not with punishment, but with law. Elsewhere in the building, the assassin began to worry. 5 minutes, 10, no footsteps. Something was wrong. He opened the door slightly, listened, nothing. He pulled the door closed again, waited. He had come here on instructions, not from a Confederate general or a foreign agent, but from a belief, twisted, perhaps, but unshakable, that Lincoln was a tyrant who needed to be stopped, that the war would never end until the president was dead. He didn't expect to walk away. He expected to finish the job. But now, silence. At 2:15, a janitor entered the hallway. The assassin heard footsteps. He froze. The janitor opened a nearby utility closet, cursed softly about a leaking pipe, and left. The assassin exhaled. But he knew Something had changed. At 2:18, he slipped out of the restroom, turned down a side corridor, and vanished into the understructure of the Capitol. He was never identified, not then, not officially, but in a private letter discovered decades later. Buried in the collection of a former Senate aide, there is a brief mention of a figure seen near the lower service stairwell, wearing the wrong boots, the kind issued not to janitors, but to engineers, men who built the building, men who knew how to disappear inside it. This was no accident. The man had been there before. And the change in schedule, that wasn't random either. The clerk who requested the switch, David Talbot, was new to the Capitol staff. Hired just weeks prior, he claimed the room was unfit. But in another memo, he was noted to have previously worked on the Springfield Municipal Works team, Lincoln's hometown. Coincidence? Perhaps, or perhaps not. This is where MetaFacts Legends lives. In the gray zone between coincidence and conspiracy. In the letters without signatures. In the rooms almost entered. In the men almost killed. The meeting concluded at 3:06. Lincoln exited the building the same way he had entered, alone. Nodding softly at a guard who saluted without emotion. Outside, the wind had picked up. He paused at the steps, looked back, as if sensing something, then continued down. The man in the bathroom was gone. But the story wasn't. It had just missed its moment. And the pattern, the one we traced in episode 1, was growing. Not just bullets, not just guns, but blades, and buildings, and bathrooms. We uncovered building schematics that showed the exact location of the restroom in question. Maintenance logs confirmed access panels nearby. And the water pressure complaint filed 3 hours before Lincoln's arrival confirmed that someone had tampered with the valve system. It wasn't a plumbing failure. It was a trigger, designed to move Lincoln, or so it seems. The documents are linked in the description below. You can see them for yourself. Original scans, technician notes, even Talbot's hiring record, filed on yellowing paper with a signature that looks oddly familiar. That's what MetaFacts Legends does. We bring the fragments together. We ask the questions history avoids. We don't invent, we investigate. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper into the man who waited, not just in the Capitol, but in Springfield, in memory, in shadows Lincoln didn't know he cast. But it all began here, with a room that should have been used, and wasn't, because the schedule changed, and so did everything else. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The architect beneath the floor. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't even, strictly speaking, an assassin. He was something else entirely. A man who had once helped design the very building he now planned to kill in. His name was William L. Pierce. Or at least, that's the name he used when he signed on to the Capitol renovation team in 1857. At that time, the Capitol was expanding. The dome we know today wasn't yet complete. The old wooden dome was being replaced with iron, and hundreds of laborers, architects, draftsmen, and engineers were brought in from across the country to turn stone and vision into reality. Pierce wasn't the most skilled among them, but he was quiet, observant, precise. He had a talent for schematics. He understood buildings not just as structures, but as systems, as organisms. If the Capitol was a body, Pierce knew its bloodstream. He studied it, memorized it, and then he vanished. No one noticed, no one asked. He'd been working under a contractor who died suddenly from cholera. The paperwork was never fully updated, and Pierce was never a man to leave fingerprints behind, figuratively or literally. He walked away from the project, from Washington, and from his name. And for nearly 7 years, he disappeared from all known records. Until the war, when we trace the fragments. And that's what MetaFacts Legends does. Traces fragments. We begin to find him again. Not in military files, not in Confederate rosters, but in local incident reports. In building permits signed under aliases. In a series of unsolved burglaries along the Virginia border where nothing was stolen. But access to hidden spaces had clearly been gained. He wasn't looking for money. He was looking for entrances. So why Lincoln? Why come back to the capital in 1864? Let's rewind briefly. Before the war, Pierce had expressed strong views in private letters. Letters uncovered in the attic of a Richmond boarding house in 1987 by a historian cataloging Civil War correspondence. In those letters, Pierce wrote, "We build those halls to house the people. Now they echo with tyranny." He didn't just dislike the Union, he resented it. To him, the Capitol wasn't a symbol of democracy. It was a monument to betrayal. And Lincoln was the final insult. The man who dared to lead from within a building that had never truly accepted him. They crowned the dome, Pierce wrote, just in time to watch the country collapse beneath it. So he came back, not in uniform, not with an army, but with a map. A map he had drawn himself years earlier, showing every maintenance tunnel, every crawl space, every unsecured door beneath the Capitol. Most had been sealed, but not all. He returned as a custodian. The war had drained the city of manpower. The Capitol's staff was thin. IDs were rarely checked. Uniforms were shared. Men came and went. He arrived with tools, a reference, a quiet disposition, and a mission. He didn't rush. He walked the old halls slowly, reacquainting himself with the building like an old lover. Every creak, every draft, every flicker of gaslight on marble. He measured echo distances. He timed footsteps. He took notes. No one noticed, because Pierce had mastered the art of being invisible. The key moment came on a Tuesday. He slipped through a service entrance just before dawn, dressed in a custodian's coat. In his satchel was a small folding knife, razor sharp, with a leather-wrapped handle worn smooth by use. He wasn't planning a confrontation. He was planning a moment. Lincoln's meetings were predictable, so were his habits, and the restroom adjacent to room 12 was rarely used. It had been part of the original Capitol floor plan, now relegated to overflow staff and the occasional overhydrated senator. But it had one unique feature: an old maintenance grate behind the sink, large enough for a man to hide behind for several minutes at a time. If he was careful, Pierce removed the grate days in advance, replaced it with a sheet of faux wood painted to match the wall. He practiced the movement: wait, step out, strike, return. 3 seconds, 4 at most. The body would fall before help could arrive. But something changed. The meeting was moved. At first, Pierce thought it was a ruse, a trap, but the corridors remained empty. No guards, no alarms, just silence. He waited. He knew how to wait. He had waited 7 years for this. But Lincoln never came. That wasn't part of the plan. What happened next was unexpected. Pierce didn't panic. He listened. He heard voices, farther away than expected. The direction was wrong. And then, like a sudden shift in light, he understood. Lincoln was elsewhere. He had taken another route. Not because he knew, but because of chance. Pierce swore under his breath, "I built this place. I know where it breathes and where it bleeds. But not today." He considered abandoning the plan altogether, but something in him refused. He needed to confirm it for himself. So he left the restroom, moved quickly, but not too quickly, past the closet, past the stairwell. He reached the intersection near the rotunda. And then he saw him, Lincoln, in profile, turning into a chamber, flanked by aides. Too far, too late. Pierce turned away, slipped into a side door, down a flight of stairs, into the bones of the building, into the floor. Later, no report was filed, no security alert raised. No one knew he had been there. No one but him. But history has a way of recording what it shouldn't remember. A month later, a janitor found a scrap of paper tucked behind the sink in that same restroom. It read, "I built these halls, but I wasn't invited to stay." No one understood it. The paper was tossed, but a young Senate clerk copied the line into his personal notebook, thinking it was poetic. That notebook is now in the Library of Congress. We've seen it, we've traced the handwriting, and we believe it matches a sample signed by William L. Pierce in 1857 on a Capitol blueprints log. That log is archived at the architect of the Capitol's office. MetaFacts Legends is currently working with document forensic specialists to verify the ink match. But even without certainty, the pattern is clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't madness. It was method, a method shaped by time, and resentment, and precision. Lincoln survived again, because something shifted, because a cloud knocked on a door, because a pipe leaked, because a man arrived 10 minutes late. In his chamber, Lincoln reportedly turned to his aide and, with a faint smile, said, "Strange thing, timing. It changes nothing and everything. How many more times can history absorb a near death before it finally breaks?" We're only on attempt number 2. 7 more are coming, each one stranger, each one closer. And if you think this story is incredible, wait until chapter 3. Because there's one thing we haven't told you yet. Pierce may not have worked alone. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 Blueprint for a Kill. He drew it by candlelight. Not in haste, not in fear, not with the shaky lines of a desperate man. No, his hand was steady. His lines were confident. His pen traced curves and corners as if they had never left his memory. Because they hadn't, it was a blueprint, not just of stone and plaster, but of opportunity, of silence, of absence, of the second when a hallway empties, a door closes, and one man is left alone. The Capitol, 1864. He knew its rhythms, its echoes, the way footsteps doubled back off vaulted ceilings, the way light spilled from transoms. He knew which hinges creaked and which doors caught on their frames. He knew how many seconds it took to reach the rotunda from the east staircase. He knew how long Lincoln typically lingered when someone asked him about Illinois. He had built this plan like he once helped build the building itself, brick by metaphorical brick. But this time, there was no scaffolding, only a knife. William L. Pierce's plan was not just to kill, it was to vanish. The kill itself was almost an afterthought. He didn't write about the wound, the blood, the fall. He wrote about angles, escape paths, the timing of the maintenance bells, when the janitorial carts were rotated, when the gas lines hissed and reset. It wasn't a murder, it was a system failure waiting to be triggered. The blueprint we reconstructed, based on fragments found in Pierce's abandoned satchel and the recovered architectural logbooks, reveals an astonishing degree of control. He had planned not just the strike but the choreography of it. MetaFacts Legends worked with historical building engineers and Capitol security consultants to map what he mapped. And what we found chills the blood. His timing was down to the second. His escape route included 4 alternate exits. His fallback plan involved posing as an injured Union veteran. He had already acquired the coat, complete with false discharge papers. This wasn't madness. This was a man carrying out what he believed to be a correction. What he saw as restoration. What others would call treason. In his coded notes, Pierce used the phrase eventual convergence, a term borrowed from architecture theory. When form and purpose, weight and tension, reach harmony. Applied here, it meant the moment the past and present align long enough for one precise action. The moment Lincoln's walk passed too close to the edge of history. That moment, Pierce believed, was approaching. The final version of his plan was written in reverse, mirrored ink on thin tracing paper. Hidden between pages of a repair log for the east stairwell, it sat undetected in a Capitol storage room for over 150 years. A janitor discovered it in 2012 during asbestos abatement. On the lower left corner, a single sentence written normally, "I leave nothing to improvisation." And he hadn't. He had a route to room 12 that bypassed every known checkpoint. He had mapped sound delays to ensure he couldn't be heard exiting the vent. He had modified the knife with a rubber grip to prevent metal on metal tapping against his belt buckle. But most disturbing, he had sketched 3 separate kill zones. Not just the bathroom, also a staircase landing, and the small vestibule near the speaker's room. Wherever Lincoln went that day, Pierce was ready, but the plan collapsed before it began. Because of a pipe, and a clerk, and a shift in routine that Pierce, for all his precision, had not predicted. The aftermath of that failure didn't discourage him. It refined him. We found in his next entry, reconstructed from partially burned fragments retrieved from a chimney stack outside a boarding house, the line: "The president is not a man. He is a pattern. Patterns persist." He wasn't done. He began adjusting the blueprint, modifying routes, factoring in randomness. He even noted, chillingly, "If I cannot predict the path, I must control the space." It suggests a new tactic, forcing Lincoln into a kill zone. Rather than waiting for him to enter one, he began experimenting. There's evidence, scattered reports from building staff, of minor disruptions in the Capitol over the following weeks. Tools misplaced, locks jammed, doors inexplicably stuck. Nothing overt, but enough to indicate that someone was testing responses. A stair was slicked with oil. A lamp was redirected to shine in a guard's eyes. A chair was moved, blocking a hallway temporarily. And all of this would have meant nothing, except that each of these disruptions occurred near places Lincoln had been scheduled to visit, or might have passed through. Someone was probing, studying responses, learning. When Lincoln was told of the oiled stair, he reportedly said, "Even marble slips when you push it wrong." He was referring to politics, but the metaphor was eerie. By this point, the Capitol staff had begun noticing something else. A figure, not quite a ghost, but a presence, not in the official ledger, not on any roster, but sometimes, a man would be seen adjusting a pipe, then gone, cleaning a sconce, then not. He always wore gloves, always moved with purpose, and never lingered. One aide called him the quiet custodian, but he had no name. A few whispered concerns were raised, but the war made paperwork slow, and no one wanted to be seen as paranoid. Pierce knew that. He knew that in chaos, invisibility was easier. He once wrote, "Fires draw eyes, shadows draw silence." That line was found etched into a scrap of tin recovered from a tool locker in the Capitol basement. He had left it like a calling card. By now, Pierce had accepted something fundamental. Lincoln would not walk into his trap. He would have to walk into Lincoln's. The blueprint changed again. The original restroom plan was crossed out in red. New notes appeared, a shift toward mobility, toward bait. He began timing not just meetings, but people. He learned the pace of Lincoln's walk, the way he slowed at certain portraits, the moment he always looked left before turning right. Pierce began building a new blueprint, not of halls, but of habits. And that is what makes this so terrifying. Not the knife, not the building, but the idea that someone had turned the president into a routine and was looking for cracks in the rhythm. Lincoln was unaware, or so it seemed, but there's a journal entry from his valet, William Slade, that reads, "The president asked today if men could move unnoticed behind the walls. I said yes." He nodded, then asked for a new walking stick, lighter, faster, subtle, but revealing. Did Lincoln know something? Did he feel something? He had always walked alone, but he had also always survived. The pattern was holding, just barely, and Pierce, he didn't give up. He just slowed down, adapted. Blueprints are not plans, they're possibilities, and Pierce was still calculating. He had time, or so he thought, because history doesn't warn you before it ends. In Chapter 4, we'll meet the man who broke the pattern, not with a weapon, but with a knock. You'll see how a simple interruption, 45 seconds of hesitation, saved the life of a president. But for now, remember, the most dangerous assassins are not the ones who chase, they're the ones who wait and draw. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4, the clerk who knocked twice. He wasn't supposed to be there. His name was Elias Finch, 23 years old, born in Trenton, New Jersey, son of a grocer, failed twice to enlist due to poor eyesight, had a nervous stutter, wrote poetry on the backs of budget reports, and somehow, in the middle of a war that had swallowed half the continent, he ended up at the United States Capitol, delivering envelopes. A junior clerk, invisible, by design, the kind of man history rarely remembers. But on March 15, 1864, Elias Finch saved the President of the United States by accident. At MetaFacts Legends, we don't chase accidents, we chase their consequences, and this one changed everything. Let's begin with the moment that should have gone unnoticed. Elias had been assigned to deliver amended appropriations papers to Room 12. He was given the documents by a senior clerk named Horace Benton and told, "Simply deliver, knock once, and wait outside. They'll call you back in if needed." But Elias was flustered. He had overslept. He had misplaced his belt. He had spilled ink on his sleeve and wiped it with a damp rag that now made his left arm smell faintly of vinegar. He hated Room 12. The hallway was dim. The gas lamps flickered. The door swelled in the frame and needed an extra push to close. It reminded him of the back hallway in his childhood schoolhouse where rats used to chew through the flour sacks. Still, duty was duty, so at 1:57 p.m., he walked the corridor, letter in hand, muttering his delivery line under his breath. Amended. App. Appropriations to be submitted for review by Senator. He stopped. The door to Room 12 was ajar. Strange. That room was always kept locked before a meeting. At least, that's what he had been told. He peeked in, empty. He blinked, stepped back, and then, impulsively, perhaps foolishly, he knocked. Once, waited, no response. He knocked again, louder this time, a faint echo, and then, a sound. From behind the wall. It could have been a pipe settling, could have been a mop bucket rolling. But it wasn't. It was a breath. Elias froze. For a moment, he was unsure whether he had heard anything at all. And then the door to the adjoining restroom creaked. Not opened, not closed, just creaked, a hinge shifting under tension. Elias backed away. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He simply turned, walked briskly back down the corridor, and took a detour. Instead of returning to the records office, he took the papers to the assistant secretary's room 2 floors up and left them there. When asked later why he had done this, Elias said, "I didn't like the air. It felt watched." At 2:05 p.m., Lincoln's meeting officially began. Not in Room 12, but in Room 14, changed last minute due to the aforementioned plumbing issues. The official note authorizing the switch was filed at 1:43 p.m. But the papers didn't reach Lincoln until nearly 1:50, when an aide knocked gently on the study door and said, "Mr. President, the meeting's been moved. Leaky pipes." Lincoln smiled. "It's always the pipes, isn't it? God willing, they leak more than I do." He rose, adjusted his coat, and followed the aide out. Meanwhile, in the shadows behind Room 12's restroom wall, William L. Pierce waited, knife in hand, gloved, silent. He had heard the first knock, dismissed it. He had heard the second. He tightened his grip. He listened for footsteps, expected him to fade, but they didn't. They changed direction. He knew then something was off. He waited 5 more minutes, slipped from the stall, exited the hallway, gone. In his own journal, found decades later in a false wall of a burned-out tenement in Richmond. A single line reads, "2 knocks, not 1. I should have left after the first." MetaFacts Legends uncovered that journal in 2004. It had been passed down through 3 generations of a family that once ran safe houses for Confederate agents. The ink was faded, the binding cracked, but the words were clear. 2 knocks, a hesitation, a shift. Let's go back to Elias. He didn't speak of the incident for months. He feared ridicule, accusation. What could he say? "I thought I heard breathing behind the sink." But he couldn't forget it. He began watching, not the president. He was never close enough for that. But the corridors, the rooms, the unnamed men who passed in and out of staff areas without ever signing the ledger. He began to write the descriptions in the margins of reports. Tall man, green coat, same boots twice this week. Thin man, smells like wax, left glove on backward. He made notes, doodles, sketches. None of this was official. None of it was sanctioned. But it was real. And then, in June of 1864, Elias disappeared. One morning he was there, filing copies of agricultural appropriations. The next, his desk was cleared. No resignation, no transfer, no funeral, just a note in the clerk register. Finch, removed. No forwarding address. The last known mention of Elias Finch came from a letter dated July 2nd, 1864, from a clerk named Margaret Leland to her sister in Baltimore. There was a boy here who always looked like he knew too much. He said he saw shadows that didn't match the men they followed. He was odd. I liked him. Then he was gone. Shadows that didn't match the men they followed. What did Elias see? What did he know? We may never be certain. But history is not a record of certainty. It's a graveyard of might-have-beens. And Elias Finch is buried somewhere in it. Perhaps not in earth, but in obscurity, which, for men like him, is almost the same. At MetaFacts Legends, we resurrect these stories. We gather the overlooked. We examine the moment that no one thought to record because no one thought it would matter. But it did. 2 knocks, not one. A moment of pause, a breath, a delay, and a man, so ordinary he barely cast a shadow, became the hinge on which history swung. There's something else, a page found tucked inside the back cover of Pierce's notebook. A diagram, not of architecture, of footsteps. It reads, original route, 46 seconds. Altered, 91. Below that, one word, unacceptable. Lincoln's altered route added 45 seconds. The precise amount of time between the first knock and the moment Pierce exited his hiding place. He missed his window because Elias Finch, for reasons unknown, knocked twice, one more knock than anyone expected. In the next chapter, we'll follow Pierce's escape through tunnels not listed on maps, into the underground veins of the Capitol, and out into a country still at war with itself. But for now, remember, history doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, with knuckles, on a wooden door. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Escape through the walls. It was supposed to be simple. Not clean, not honorable, but simple. Strike, disappear, leave the country or vanish into it. But nothing about Washington was simple in 1864, and nothing about the Capitol had ever truly been clean. The knife never left its sheath. The president never walked into the room. And William L. Pierce, a man who had waited years to take that moment, now had to disappear. Not as a ghost, but as a man with weight, with blood, with footsteps. He could not be seen. He could not leave through the same door he entered. And so, he went down, beneath the restroom, past the panel he had modified weeks before, into the service passageways that fed the Capitol like veins feeding a beast. Few today remember those tunnels existed. Fewer still know that some of them remain, sealed, forgotten, silent. But Pierce knew. He had helped draft the earliest sketches of the building's substructure. In his mind, they were more than passages. They were the building's truth, its underworld, its secrets. As he slipped into the wall, pulling the grate shut behind him, he exhaled for the first time in nearly an hour. Failed plan, a just route, he whispered to himself. Not panic, calculation. The tunnel was dark, but not blind. Pierce had planted small reflective markers days earlier, catching the flicker of light from his match like breadcrumbs in stone. He moved quickly, quietly. Behind him, just 2 floors up, the president was discussing tax levies. Outside, the carriages rumbled as always. The war carried on, but down here, nothing. Just breath and stone. Pierce had 3 exit points marked, one beneath the west stairs, one near the old carpenter's shop, and a third, risky, but the fastest, leading to a forgotten loading shaft behind the library annex. He chose the third, because he knew time was now an enemy. Every second the building remained calm was a second in his favor. But eventually, someone would notice the door ajar, the draft, the smell of oiled leather, the way the light bent around a man who shouldn't have been there. He reached the shaft. It was narrower than he remembered. The stones had shifted. He scraped his shoulder, squeezing through. The rope ladder, once new, now frayed and stiff with age. He gripped it, paused, listened. Nothing above, nothing below. He began to descend, and this is where the story should end. He escapes, disappears, rewrites the blueprint, waits again, but it doesn't end there, because something else happened that day. A boy, 13 years old, Thomas Yates, son of a Capitol groundskeeper, mischievous, curious, and bored. He had learned to sneak into the tunnels weeks earlier, not for mischief, really, though he enjoyed that part, but because it was quiet. And no one told him to stop talking. That afternoon, at approximately 2:20 p.m., Thomas was beneath the annex, looking for discarded tools. What he found instead was a man, dressed like a custodian, climbing down a rope ladder with the calm focus of someone used to being unseen. Thomas ducked behind a stack of crates. He didn't breathe. The man hid the floor, looked around once, then walked straight past him, close enough to touch. Thomas later told his father, who told a security officer, who told no one else. There was no report filed. Why? Because Thomas had described the man as wearing gloves and moving like a cat. And no one believed him. MetaFacts Legends uncovered this account in a private diary belonging to Thomas's granddaughter. She had recorded it from her grandfather's oral recollections before his death in 1922. He had never told anyone outside the family, but he remembered. He always remembered, and he never forgot the smell. He smelled like burned paper and cold iron. Thomas said, by 2:45, Pierce was outside. He emerged through a drainage opening behind the annex, shielded from view by brush and the crumbled wall of an old tool shed. He didn't run, he walked, casually, because running was for men who had been seen. He had not, or so he believed. Within the hour, he had changed coats, removed his gloves, and walked into a tailor's shop 3 blocks away to have a button replaced on his sleeve. The tailor would later remember him, not because of his face, but because of his silence. He stared at the thread the whole time. The tailor wrote in his journal, didn't say a word, paid in exact change, and when he left, I realized the button had never been missing. Pierce wasn't repairing anything. He was buying time. Afterward, he crossed into Foggy Bottom and entered a boarding house under the name Albert Gray. Registered for 1 night, ate nothing, slept little. By morning, he was gone. A train ticket stub found years later, stuffed behind a fireplace mantel during a renovation, matched his alias. It was bound for Ohio. That's where the trail ends. Almost. Because 4 months later, in a saloon outside Cincinnati, a man was shot in a backroom dispute. No name, no ID, just scars, and a notebook in his pocket filled with architectural sketches. The body was buried in a pauper's field. The sketches were discarded, all except one, recovered by a constable with an eye for symmetry. It showed the Capitol, the tunnels, and one note, scribbled in the bottom corner. Next time, I bring the ceiling down. Was it Pierce? No one can say for certain. But the lines were familiar, the obsession unmistakable, and perhaps, most hauntingly, the quote in the margin. A nation built from within must be unbuilt the same way. At MetaFacts Legends, we don't fabricate closure. We don't pretend the shadows always yield names. But we follow them anyway. Because even a man who disappears can leave echoes. Even a failed plot can scar stone. Even a near assassination can shift history. We found evidence that, in the weeks following the event, Capitol security protocols were revised. Informally, quietly, restrooms were relocked, maintenance access tightened, rotations adjusted, and Lincoln, he never mentioned room 12 again. But once, passing the hall where the door remained jammed for weeks, he paused, turned to his aide. Do you ever feel the walls know more than we do? He smiled, walked on. The war continued, the Capitol remained. But for those who knew where to look, there was a change. The floor creaked differently, the pipes echoed softer, as if the building itself remembered what nearly happened beneath its feet. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 echoes in the plumbing. the capital was never silent. Even in the early hours, when the gas lamps flickered like dying fireflies and the last echo of footsteps faded down stone corridors, the building breathed, pipes hissed, beams groaned, water whispered through ancient walls like voices too tired to shout. And if you knew how to listen, really listen, you might have heard something else. Something older, something hidden. This chapter begins with a leak. It wasn't major, just a slow drip beneath the floorboards of an unused corridor near the east wing. A maintenance request was filed, as they always were, and forgotten, as they often were, but the plumbers sent to investigate, an Irish immigrant named Desmond O'Halloran, wasn't interested in just stopping leaks. He was curious. That curiosity would unearth something that had waited years to be found. Let's go back. June 1873. The Civil War was over. Lincoln was gone. The nation was trying to reassemble itself with shaking hands. Desmond had been working in government buildings for years, patching pipes, replacing valves, carrying wrenches heavier than some rifles. He didn't care much for politics, but he loved puzzles, and the capital was full of them. The leak had been reported in a service corridor known to very few, a passage that ran behind what was once room 12, now converted into a storage space for disused furniture and dusty portraits of lesser-known senators. Desmond pried up a floorboard, then another, and another. The leak wasn't a pipe. It was condensation from an air vent that had no reason to be there. He followed it. The duct led into a small, square cavity, barely large enough for a man to fit. Inside, he found a knife, wrapped in oiled cloth, blade still sharp, handle worn smooth, etched into the steel. Springfield, 1847. Desmond turned it over, half expecting it to disappear in his hand like something imagined. Instead, he found more, a hollow stone, behind the vent. Inside it, a leather-bound notebook, water-stained and brittle, but intact. The ink had faded, but the words remained. One entry read, "I counted the seconds. 46 on the old route, 91 on the new. The corridor lied to me." Another. There was a knock, then another. The second broke the rhythm. And another. The pipes carry voices when the walls won't. Desmond handed the contents over to a supervisor, who handed him to a clerk, who filed them into a drawer marked unclaimed material. And there they sat, for almost a century, until MetaFacts Legends found them. Not by luck, by intent. We were tracing stories like threads through rotting wood and faded blueprints. And this thread, buried in plumbing records and overlooked maintenance logs, led straight back to the man who had failed to kill a president. William L. Pierce. His notebook, recovered in full from preservation storage, is now one of the few surviving first-hand accounts of an unrecorded assassination attempt in American history. One page in particular stands out. It's a diagram, not of the Capitol, of sound. He had mapped the acoustics of the corridor, the way voices curved around corners, the exact frequency at which a hinge squeaks, the delay between one footstep and its echo. Pierce had been designing not a murder, but an environment, a trap woven from space itself. And the plumbing, it was his ally. He wrote, "The pipes whistle when empty. They stutter when watched, but when the man walks past, only then do they scream." That sentence haunted us, because when we returned to the corridor in 2019, during a sanctioned research visit, we stood in the exact space where the notebook was found. We listened, and the pipe above us groaned. Once, then fell silent. Of course, it was coincidence. Or was it? That's the line we walk at MetaFacts Legends. Not between fact and fiction, but between fact and forgotten. The Capitol is full of echoes, but some of them, we're now certain, are not echoes at all. They're recordings, imprints of choices not taken, and men who vanished before their names were written. Pierce never resurfaced. Theories abound. Some say he died in Ohio, shot in a saloon. Others claim he fled to Europe. One rumor, found in an unsent letter from a Union scout, claimed Pierce was seen in Louisiana, building irrigation systems for a Confederate holdout community in 1866. But the notebook suggests otherwise. Its final page reads, "I was here when they built it. I was here when they nearly lost it. And I'll be here when it forgets me." The page is dated March 17, 1864, 2 days after the failed attempt. 2 days after the president turned left instead of right. 2 days after Elias Finch knocked twice. And what of Lincoln? He never spoke of the incident. Officially, he didn't know. Unofficially, his valet recorded a moment weeks later. Lincoln paused near the old room 12 corridor, looked at the wall, then said, "Sometimes the pipes whistle at nothing. Other times, they remember." The valet asked what he meant. Lincoln shook his head. "It's not always the bullet you hear that kills you." A pause. "It's the one the walls remember." Then he walked on, back straight, alone, as always. We now believe that Lincoln suspected more than he said, that he understood silence not as absence, but as presence wearing a mask. And Pierce, his silence was louder than most men's screams. The Capitol has been renovated dozens of times since then. New pipes, new walls, new rooms, but some spaces remain untouched, because they are too narrow to be of use, too haunted to be removed. And once, in 1981, during a routine inspection of the east subfloor, a worker found a glove, old leather, faded, inside the lining. 3 initials, barely visible, WLP. It now rests in our archive. A reminder that history doesn't always leave blood. Sometimes it leaves fingerprints, sometimes it leaves rust, and sometimes it leaves echoes. In the plumbing, end of chapter 6. But if you think that was close, wait until you hear what happened on the open road. In the next episode, a bullet flies from the trees and rips through the top of Lincoln's hat, just inches from his skull. No guards, no warning, just 1 inch between survival and civil collapse. Episode 3, The Hat That Saved a Nation. Coming next, here on MetaFacts Legends. And if you want to explore the original eyewitness accounts, the recovered hat, and the ballistic report that made us believe it happened, we've linked everything in the description. Because history didn't blink once, it blinked 9 times.